morning, everybody. It's called Diebold Irvington Historical Society. We're going to talk about Irvington's curvy streets today. And I'll start with the graphic here. It's just a simplified version of what the Irvington plan looks like. Those of you who are familiar with Irvington and Indianapolis, Indiana, are familiar with this street plan. And you can see that it's quite different from everything around it in terms of the way the streets curve. And so that plat was filed in 1870, but there's some interesting background on why that was chosen. And there have been various rumors and stories. Oh, they followed a wandering cow and they were laying the streets out and so forth. And the simple answer is the streets curve in Irvington because they wanted them to. And it all goes back to the way community planning was done in the 19th century in the United States. Of course, in most communities, there was what we call the orthogonal grid, and that just means a grid of squares or rectangles with the streets at right angles to each other. And actually, that kind of plan, interestingly enough, has its own history. It goes back to ancient Greece, and very famously, there's the story of Miletus on the Mediterranean coast of Turkey, which was a Greek colony, and the Greeks were fighting the Persians like they always were, and the Persians had wiped Miletus out, and there was a dispute on how the community would be put back together, because people were saying, well, I own this piece of land, and no, I own this one, and so the decision was made, we're just going to lay out a grid. Rationalize it, lay out a grid, everyone gets a square, it's all nice and fair. And so over time, over the millennia really, that kind of solution was adopted by Romans and by various Western powers, and it was especially a popular thing for colonialization. Because if you're out in the wilderness, you're laying out a street grid, you're kind of just surveying land, it was the easiest way to do it. So over time though, people began to realize this was really not a very pleasant way to design a community sometimes. Sometimes you wanted a little bit of relief from that grid. And so the first communities in the United States to look at this sort of problem were actually communities for the dead. Cemeteries. Mount Auburn in Massachusetts was a very famous cemetery. It was laid out in the 1830s, and it was inspired by English gardens, which would have these meandering paths and a kind of a naturalistic look to them. And wasn't too long after that, 1853, Llewellyn Park in New Jersey was an early suburb and actually one of America's first gated communities, maybe somewhat dubious honor there. And it had the meandering street pattern, and it was laid out by Alexander Jackson Davis, one of our first landscape designers in the United States. And actually 1853 is an important date because that is when Glendale, Ohio, a beautiful suburb of Cincinnati, Ohio, was laid out. And that was at the end of a rail line. And actually that rail line eventually does connect to Indianapolis and to Irvington. It was at the bottom of my map that I just showed you. That community was laid out in 1853 with the meandering street pattern. If you've ever been to Glendale, you recognize the connection right away. So the connection to Irvington was really fairly direct. When Johnson and Julian were planning Irvington in the late 1860s, they sent their friend, the Wayne County engineer, Robert Howard, and directed him to please go study Glendale, Ohio. We want something like that for this new town of Irvington that we're laying out. And he worked his way down to Glendale, Ohio, and saw how beautiful it was, and came up with a plan, the plan that I showed you earlier, inspired by Glendale, Ohio. So these early communities then continued to inspire places like this in Indianapolis, Riverside in Chicago, Illinois. If you've been to Riverside, it's a very beautiful community also. And you get these meandering street patterns such as the one right behind me. We're here on Julian Avenue, and you can see where it merges with Johnson Avenue, the way it creates a great deal of interest and a great deal of headaches for surveyors of land. If you've bought land here in Irvington, you know full well no two surveyors will really come up with quite the same diagram for what you own. But it's all good. No one really argues much over whose fence is where and so forth, because we all know we're a great community. So that's really our lesson for today. The streets curve in Irvington because it was beautiful, and it still is. I'm going to leave you with our request for help. Please become a member. Please support us here at Irvington Historical Society. We're keeping the history and heritage of this place alive, and we appreciate your support. And we'll see you next time, everyone. Have a great weekend.